Welcome back to What's Occurring. I'm Lloyd and today we're outside the House of Parliament in London with an exclusive interview with Neil Kinnock, famous Cardiff University alumni and leader of the opposition for Labour. He's talked to us today to give him a view of his own general politics and thoughts about the university. Fancy hearing what he has to say? Stay tuned.
I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was 14. I was allowed to join 3 months before the official date by a very friendly county councillor in Tredegar, which is where I was born and brought up. And then I went to Cardiff and joined the Socialist Society. And as these things happen, because I was in the room, I was elected secretary after being in university about 3 or 4 months. And then I became, the following year, when I talked a young woman from Anglesey into becoming secretary in her 3rd week in university. I married her, or she married me. That made it legitimate. I became president of the Socialist Society, and we were extremely active politically, not just in student politics, indeed not even mainly in student politics, but in '64 there was the general election in which Labour won after 13 years of Tory rule, and then '66 when Labour won a big majority. But in between times, of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were the Rivonia trials of Nelson Mandela and his colleagues. And the late 60s, were a swirl of political activity in which we were heavily engaged. So that was not a baptism of fire, but a baptism in which fire wasn't absent. Not really. I would have been active and engaged in politics in any case as an activist. What did assist, I guess, is that when I went to university, the first year I played rugby and I sang a lot and I was out with the lads a lot. Then Glenys arrived. I met her, poor girl, on her first day in university, and she let me take her home, or rather she took me home from the dance, the hop as we used to call it, in the first Saturday. And I started to take her home, but I had a kick in the head and I was suffering from delayed concussion. So I passed out and she ended up taking me home from our first date. So in order to impress her, the following Friday, I spoke in the debate. And the debates union in the university in those days was very active, packed out, and very, very rumbustious. They invented, I think, the word scholarly indifference and defiance and complete absence of deference and good manners. So it was hellish. But I managed to get through that, and I managed to impress her, and that was the intention. Then I found myself stuck with being not only actively engaged in the Socialist Society, but in the politics of the Union. So in a sense, it was a sort of involuntary training, because I learned to take the punches as well as giving them, and learned to be indifferent to insult, and to enjoy a little bit of praise. And I suppose that's a fair old grounding in active politics. I think that if it involves invasions of premises, the university is within its rights to try to prevent the possibility of damage and of disruption that could affect students who are not directly engaged. Otherwise, I think that efforts to prevent protest as a general practice are fruitless in any case. We had no voice or agency. We had a hell of a lot of noise and nobody took any notice, as you would expect. And I can say from the great height of being 83 years of age, there are times when much more notice should be taken of youthful opinions and concerns. And the fact that they're held by young people doesn't invalidate them in any way whatsoever. In fact, in some cases, it makes those concerns more profound, and it makes some of the answers more useful. But in the nature of human society, very little premium is attached to youthful wisdom. In fact, that's thought to be a confusion in terms. So I would have liked more interest to be taken and action to be taken on the basis of my generation's recommendations, but it was never going to happen. And I don't think people ought to be disappointed or frustrated when they're not heeded today. That in itself is a kind of a lesson and the spur to further motivation. So people shouldn't worry too much about that. The thing is, if what people are doing is born of serious purpose, progressive and enlightened purpose, and their convictions run deep, they'll hold on to them and be able to apply them in practical conditions. If the convictions are shallow and they're afraid of compromise and not aware that most progress is gradual and cumulative, then the convictions that they've got are not really worth having in the first place. So there's just one moral I draw, not a moral, a lesson I draw from it all. And it is that the way to avoid disillusionment is to try to avoid illusions in the first place. And if people can do that while sustaining serious enlightened purpose, that's a good combination.
So you'd say a lot of what was happening in those days was an illusion?
No, it was serious purpose. I mean, the concerns that people had, the terror that people felt over the Cuba crisis, for instance, the bitterness that they felt, partly because of acquaintance with students from the Middle East, for instance, over conditions in occupied Palestine, the West Bank, and concerns that people had about living conditions in the United Kingdom, rack rent landlords, abuse of landlords' rights, low pay, all those concerns that are still tragically current. They're worth bothering about. So they weren't illusory in any way at all. Anybody who thought that there was some sudden and dramatic, immediate way of resolving the concerns would have been suffering from illusions. But I don't think there were many people who thought it could happen with dramatic suddenness. The test always is, can you endure when you appear to be making little headway? And the tribute I'd pay to some of my colleagues is that they went on to gain, in very many cases, distinction in their fields of study and in their professions, and still endured in their convictions. And I think that's highly commendable. Well, I'm not keen on the ideology, because it too easily turns into dogmatism, and that to me is poisonous, because it means fixed ideas that don't pay sufficient attention to inevitable and continual changes in circumstances. So ideological stances, doctrinaire stances, I've always tried to avoid or discourage. However, having a sense of conviction or having principles that can be effective in practice, which is the only real test, is, I think, necessary. Politics that lacks conviction lacks direction. There's no compass. There's no chart, and it can mean that politicians who are without that equipment can be driven by the winds, and the winds change. So I think that it's stupid to have fixations ideologically, but I think you're impoverished if you don't have basic values that are applicable in practical conditions.
Do you think the winds are pushing around the current Prime Minister?
I know that he's a man of very deeply rooted principles and highly intelligent and in many, many ways admirable, not only because of what he's accomplished in his life, but because of what he wants to do for the country and the rising generations. He's inherited appalling conditions, and I think what will get him through is the values that he holds to. I just wish they were expressed with greater determination and clarity, so that the Labour Party generally and the country generally had a clearer indication of purpose and direction. I'm certain that Gair knows what he's doing and why he's doing it. And in conversation, I'm sure he could convince anyone of the fact that those attitudes, those values that he has, are productive and essential guidance. I just wish he'd communicate those with more assertiveness and greater transparency. Well, radicalism without means is, it's a word, doesn't mean a hell of a lot. So the important thing is to ensure that you've got the resources, the revenues that enable you to fund effective change that can alter people's lives to advantage. And the major challenge that the government faces at the moment, of course, is obtaining those revenues. Now, the challenge comes at two levels. One is the obvious direct challenge of achievement, of restoring so many of the vital public services, including the NHS and much of education. That is absolutely vital. But the other challenge is a political one, and it arises because we've endured over a decade of conservative government, which effectively stripped the services bare and guaranteed underperformance in the wider economy by underfunding public investment in both the physical and the intellectual infrastructure. So the economy is weakened in any case. And it means that the communities that were devastated by the years of Thatcherism and what followed from it, over the subsequent period, rightly feel that they've been neglected, left behind. So their resentment takes the form of votes for populist nationalist parties. And it does mean that the current government has to face a challenge arising out of conditions that are not in any way their fault. So they've got to try and repair the devastation that has accumulated and has terrible effect over the best part of 30 years, whilst dealing with fresh challenges deriving from everything from Brexit to coronavirus to Putin's murderous criminality in Ukraine, and the challenge of China and the mindlessness, the cruel mindlessness of Donald Trump. So they've got to fight today's battles while helping as much as they can to overcome the consequences of what occurred in this country in the 1980s and early 90s. Now, I'm not trying to avoid responsibility on their behalf, but I think when that dimension is comprehended, people can understand the current challenge, both in direct policy terms and also in political terms, and why populist nationalism has surged and is having an appeal. And then if they think about it hard enough, they begin to comprehend how it can effectively be combated and the tide turned, so that rational, responsible, accountable, democratic politics can be reasserted in our country. That's a main challenge for the government. Oh, yes, yes. Simply because it relies so heavily on sowing and harvesting grievance, resentment, division. And I know why its messages have got an appeal. I also know that they're entirely superficial and exploitative. And I think given long enough, people realize what a bunch of snake oil statesmen and con men they really are. But we haven't got the time to allow for consciousness to improve. I think we've got to assist it by pointing out what they've stood for, what they stand for, what their so-called policies are, and how superficial and synthetic they are, how impractical they would be if they were ever put into practice. So I think that one of our duties is the exposure of Farage and Reform and all the rest of it for the charlatans that they are. Yes, certainly. I'm in favour of a more proportionate system. And there are some systems that could really benefit the United Kingdom, especially proportionate systems that would sustain the constituency system, which I think is crucially important. And I don't want multi-member constituencies, one constituency, one representative, which I think benefits clarity and transparency, as well as the quality of public service. So I'm very much in favour of a more proportionate system. I have been, especially since 1983, when Margaret Thatcher got 1,000% of the power on 42.7% of the vote. And the division in the anti-conservative majority provided massive benefit for the Conservative Party for most of the last century. So I'm in favour of securing change. The real difficulty we've got now is, first of all, there are people in all parties who still continue to believe that the current first-past-the-post system provides stability and continuity. I think that you only have to open your eyes to see the absolute falsehood of that. It did exist, as you suggest, when British political opinion broadly divided into two and a bit. And there was a rough proportionality about election results. that rough proportionality has turned into disproportionality now, which is why it's got to be rectified. We've now got a country with a first-past-the-post system and a tactically voting electorate. I think it's confused. I really do think the country is confused. Some of the confusion is attributable to the means of communication we've got, notably a press, which is still significant, that is almost entirely owned by billionaire tax exiles who then give us lectures on patriotism, which I find very interesting, he said with some irony through gritted teeth. Anyway, the confusion also, if we want to be very grand about it, is to do with a system which has taught generations that this was a great imperial power that fought 2 world wars, had its moments of heroism, which is the true bit, because of the endurance and courage of the population generally, and then fell into lassitude and laziness and ineffectuality, which of course is entirely manufactured. And there are now people who are earning reputations and gaining political support by offering this extremely inaccurate and very misleading nostalgia in place of accurate history, and also make a living out of bemoaning the condition of the country, giving the impression that it's, quote, quote, broken, that it's damaged beyond repair. And the only way in which past glories can be restored is if we stop immigration. I mean, you know the narrative. I don't have to tell you anything about that. And of course, most of it is complete rubbish, including the bit about immigration. There's still great instances of inventiveness, community spirit, audacity, constructiveness, originality, creativity, all wonderful characteristics, but they so rarely appear on the front pages, metaphorically speaking. I'm not just speaking about the newspapers, that this confused characteristic of the country at the moment is generated and sustained. And I very much regret that. George Orwell said, if you want to control the future, control the past. And to some degree, there are malign forces at work that are making quite a practice of inventing the past and controlling it.
And do you think on that, the soul of Britain that you speak about, that perhaps the aspect of multiculturalism is particularly unstable at the minute, with that challenge of people who are trying to put the message forward?
Yes, the unfortunate thing about multiculturalism is that it's been allowed to become a label. It's a reality. The world in which we live, by definition, is multiculturalism, or multicultural. And we are part of that world. And partly because the United Kingdom did have an empire, and the empire is coming back home, then we are bound to be multicultural. And the revolutions in transport and technology guarantee, in any case, that society is more mixed and diverse than it was even 20 years ago, let alone 50 or 80 years ago. So I think that sometimes, because multiculturalism is asserted as a curse from some quarters and as an unredeemed, an unqualified blessing in other quarters that we've actually got something called the culture war, which is about, I mean, all wars are pretty stupid, but this one is probably the stupidest of all. I mean, multiculturalism is a reality. Deal with it.
Certainly.
Enjoy it. Take advantage of it. And the moment that it's regarded with suspicion or as a malevolent force, I think we're trying to step off a moving world.
Cast a bigger shadow
Yeah,
than their cohort would
they
suggest.
don't do it much in the Commons, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it is reserved for their frequent press conferences. I mean, it's very interesting that very occasionally you will get one of them. What was that back in the summer? That new woman that got elected in the by-election. No, in the by-election. Anyway, when she got up and said, you know, will the government ban the burqa, like other civilized countries have? I mean, that was a rarity that you had a Reform Member of Parliament getting on their feet in the House of Commons and expressing what are patently highly prejudiced ideas. Otherwise, they tend to vote against just about, well, indeed, all Labour legislation and keep their words for press conferences in which they're not challenged on parliamentary terms and too frequently are allowed to get away with obfuscation, evasion, and just telling another lie. To some extent, that's inevitable.
Okay.
I mean, the existence of 24/7 rolling news and new technology means that Parliament is going to have to work very, very hard to maintain its status and function as the crucible of national opinion. So, to a degree, what you describe as the sidelining is inevitable. It's still the place where the law is made, and it's still the place where major political collisions will continue to take place. But in its day-to-day business, it really, in many ways, can't hope to rival the instantaneous nature of news creation and broadcasting. And it shouldn't try to do so. The principle that government statements should be made first to the Commons and not to press conferences is a principle really worth sustaining in the name of accountable democracy. But other than insisting on that principle enforced by the Speaker and respected by members of Parliament, it's very difficult to see how the Commons can match the generality of coverage which is now available by other means.
We talk about the movement of debate outside of the Commons, and of course in Wales we have the Senedd,
Yes.
over 20 years old. We discussed the confusion in the country and its lack of direction in some ways. But do you think that, and I know that you were hesitant about devolution.
No, I wasn't. I've never been hesitant. No, it's a good point. I've never been hesitant about devolution. I'm entirely in favor of decentralization. I have since I was, I guess, in my teens, especially in a country which has increasingly been disadvantaged by being over-centralized. So devolution as a purpose and a principle and a practice, I'm in favor of. What I opposed, I wasn't hesitant, what I opposed in the late 70s was the form of devolution that was on offer and which we've ended up with. Because my argument was then, is now, if devolution is a good idea, which it is, decentralization is a good idea, which it is essentially indeed, then it's good for everybody. And the great fault of 1978-79 and the flaw in what we've got is the fact that we've got it in Scotland, we've got it in Wales, and in England, we've now got a patchwork quilt of mayoralties, counties, unilateral, unitary authorities, and it just goes on forever in utter confusion. Now, if it was only the people directly involved, the councillors and the Aelod Seneddol and the members of the Scottish Parliament were affected, well, who gives a damn? But actually, the people are affected. They're not getting the quality of governance that they should. And what goes with that is a completely incoherent system of financial allocation. I mean, Wales is underfunded by about £3 billion. Now, this is on a £25 billion budget, so it's a hell of a lot of money. And it's underfunded partly because of the formula being employed. And Joel Barnett was a friend of mine. He started arguing against his own formula within about a year of him inventing it literally on the back of a fag packet. And we've still got it. We've still got it. And it should be changed. But it's not only that. It's the fact that decision-making is really centralized, and so is the use of resources and the collection of revenues. And it just means that the devolution we've got, instead of enhancing confidence in democracy because of proximity of decision-making and accuracy of political perceptions, is having the opposite effect. People are switching off because they can't see advantage. They can't see progress being secured by what I call the sliced loaf form of devolution we've got. And I think that it's, despite the very best efforts of great people like Eluned Morgan, and she's a wonderful woman, it's got to be rethought. And we've got to have universal decentralization, not pick and choose decentralization, what I call sore-thumb decentralization, which is the form of devolution we've got, against the background of the patchwork quilt.
Do you think though that the separate institutions are sort of creating a drifting effect within the country? You see in Scotland, do you think that actually that's damaging the country, or do you think it might be an advantage?
Well, it doesn't help. And it's inevitable to see with the kind, I come back to it, the kind of devolution we've got. Because when you've got in Whitehall in Westminster a government of one party, and in Edinburgh or Cardiff a government of a different party, you've got an automatic tension built in. You've also provided the party in Edinburgh or the party in Cardiff with an automatic alibi for anything that goes wrong. Because it's either because the centre has not allocated enough money, or the centre has allocated the power but not the money. And so you've got devolved institutions that are eunuchs. They've got all responsibility and inadequate resources to exercise the power. Now, that is a very confused and unsatisfactory set of conditions. Then you get the same party in power in Whitehall and Westminster and in the devolved administrations. So the devolved administrations carry responsibility for the central government as well as for themselves. But you haven't changed the funding formula, and you haven't altered the status of devolution. And so the consequence is the same party is in two different places is going to be pulverized from both ends. And you can see it happening. Now, I warned all about all this. I take no pleasure at all in saying I told you so. But I did warn about all this in 1978. And it wasn't rocket science. It's obvious, it's organically part of politics. It's so easy to analyze and to see. But people who wanted to, well, they claimed this would polish off nationalism. That's really worked, doesn't it? Especially in Scotland, done a brilliant job of polishing off nationalism. It gave nationalism its great opportunity, which they've seized. And so that they've been able to rule for what, the last 14 years, is it? Having a degree of power and great significance in Scotland without bearing full responsibility. So it's quite nice for them. And it doesn't work at that level either. Yeah, scrapped it with Brexit. There are people, lots of people actually, who understand that the engagement in the European Union wasn't simply an economic integration. It was a very, very important political alliance between a large number of sovereign democracies, unique in the world. And what some people realize too, though it should have been pointed out more effectively than it ever was, what some people should realize too is that Britain exercised disproportionate influence in that. Now, I celebrate that, not for nationalistic reasons, but because, generally speaking, that influence was progressive and benign. And the problem is that for much of the time that we were in the European Union, we had governments by a Conservative Party that, after initial strong enthusiasm, started to treat the European community, the European Union, as if it was the Eurovision Song Contest. And it was all about who won and who lost, and what did we gain, and how did we do down the others, and how they were trying to pillage our influence, our power, our economy. And of course, that's not the reality. It's not the reality of the community and the union. And it put us at an unnecessary disadvantage, even though British civil servants, British commissioners, British ministers, British members of the European Parliament were listened to with greater attentiveness than those of just about any other country. Only Germany matched us in influence, and that's because Germany is much the strongest, biggest economy. So they earned it by their economic efforts and their inventiveness, and the best of luck to them. Our influence derived from the quality of our representation and our diplomacy. So, you know, the European community was not built upon a British model or anything like that, but the activity that we undertook in all the institutions benefited the continent and greatly benefited Britain. Now, withdrawing from the European Union sabotaged all that. And it means that not only are we outside our largest market, which was, until Brexit, was impediment-free. If you dealt with Poland, it was only the same as dealing with Northumberland or Devon. I mean, it was as simple as that. That's all changed. So we're outside the single market, we're outside the customs union, and that's inflicted serious economic harm, very serious economic harm, which is lasting. But the political harm is just as great, and it's being partly repaired in response to the menace of Putin's imperialism. And people are more aware than they have been, for all the wrong reasons. They're more aware of the need for cohesion and unity of purpose across the European continent. And our government is taking a leading part in trying to restore that sense of interdependence and strength. Inside the European Union, there was an automatic system for providing for that. We're having to reinvent it now. I'm very glad that that's being done, but it shouldn't really be necessary, and we've sacrificed it by withdrawing. It also means that more widely, the leadership of so many other countries, especially democracies, were aghast at the decision taken by the British people and what it implied for the conduct of global political affairs. They just couldn't believe it. Many of them still can't believe it. Why we should sever such absolutely fundamental and obviously advantageous relationships. So our diplomats are still having to spend time explaining how it happened and why it happened. And very gradually, there is a process of healing, but it'll never replace the advantages of full membership, which is why I want us to re-enter as quickly as possible. I won't live to see it. I know my grandchildren will. I think my children might. Well, I think that a successful career must involve winning. And the reason being, it means that if you win, you get the democratic power to do things, to secure improvement. If you don't win, then there's a certain virtue in striving, but it's not the same thing as securing the democratic power, which is the objective of being in democratic politics. Now, winning comes in a lot of sizes. If I manage to secure housing for a family that were ill-housed, or a pension for a war veteran who wasn't getting a pension, or a social security benefit for an invalid or an elderly person in need, that was a win. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. I used to get very frustrated by the reality that because we so often had Tory government with laws that didn't take the people that I was representing into proper account, that I wasn't winning enough. And then, of course, I became leader of the party, and I was defeated twice. The second time, very nationally, very marginally. I mean, the bottom 11 Conservative majorities, when John Major got a majority of 21 in the House of Commons, total 1,240 votes. So it wasn't, but it's not winning. It's coming second. And it meant that we didn't get the democratic power to make the changes that would have benefited the country. They had to wait another 5 years for those policies. But what about youngsters who are thinking about becoming active in politics? Do it. Our democracy depends upon it. You will feel justified in doing it. You'll also have some fun, which is very important. And you might be able to contribute to the progress that you're seeking. But don't think of it ever, not for 1 millisecond, as a career.
The vocation.
It's got to be a vocation. And if you're going to get elected to anything, you can do a lot of hard work, you can gain a lot of respect, you can manifest your talents, you can do all kinds of wonderful things. If you don't get lucky, it's not going to happen. So a hell of a lot of it is luck. As long as you understand that and are still willing to try to stand up for your fellow men and women then you should get engaged in politics. If you're doing it for yourself, do something else. Take up disco dancing or fly fishing. It's less harmful. There's too many people around who really do fulfill, validate the description of politics as being showbiz for ugly people. One of those is too many. So it's much better when people are trying to, quote, quote, do good, because it's a hell of a sight better than doing harm. And it's even better than doing nothing.